$200 million infrastructure project, like what we're doing today, what we passed yesterday, helping taking care of everything from health care to God knows what else.
Only God knows. That was President Biden yesterday touting the Inflation Reduction Act. Such an interesting name. Bill that's been criticized widely on the right and some on the left, namely Senator Bernie Sanders, have also criticized it. White House Chief of Staff, however, Ron Klain, fired back at the critics while on CNN yesterday.
What are the Republicans offering about inflation other than speeches? What plans do they have to bring inflation down? In fact, they even voted on Saturday against a $35 a month cap on the price of insulin. So Democrats are fighting to lower the costs that families face. Republicans stood with the corporations to say they shouldn't pay taxes, stood with the big drug companies to say they shouldn't bring them the cost of drugs. That's not going to help with inflation at all. In fact, the Republican campaign chair of the Senate has actually proposed to raise taxes on working families.
However, not all the White House staff appeared to be on the same page. Biden's economic advisor, Jared Bernstein, got into a heated argument while on CNBC over the bill's potential tax hike on small businesses. Bernstein broke from Biden's promise that nobody making under $400,000 a year will be audited. Let's watch.
I want to be clear.
Wait a second. You don't pay the minimum. Hold on. Wait a second. You don't pay.
Audited.
Correct. No. That's not what I said.
According to CNBC, the first draft of the bill would have tweaked the taxation of carried interest or profits paid to private equity and hedge fund managers, but the rule didn't make it into the final text, which some are calling a loophole for the rich that allows investment managers to pay a lower tax rate than their own employees and other workers. Democrats ditched the provision that would have raised $14 billion over 10 years, and one senior fellow at the Brookings Institution called it a real rich benefit for the wealthiest of Americans.
So we should address the framing of that a little bit. The reason that Democrats took that part of the bill out that would have closed that loophole for the rich is because Kyrsten Sinema was opposed to it. She wanted it out. She's terrible. Democrats are very frustrated at that. It's not as though Democrats as a whole wanted that provision out. And it should be noted that, of course, if even one Republican were to cross the line and actually vote for this bill, then it wouldn't have been all on Kyrsten Sinema. So the idea that's being kind of framed as Democrats wanted tax breaks, didn't want to close a loophole that allowed rich to get away with paying lower tax rates than their employees is a little bit of a misnomer.
Right, all Republicans didn't want that.
Right. And of course, no Republicans voted for this. This is a fascinating postural reality, though, however, because this is another one of those times, just like we saw last year with the American Recovery Act, where Bernie Sanders attempted to push through genuinely populist programs that majorities of Americans want. The one that got the most airtime here was this cap on insulin prices, because it is overwhelmingly popular to keep this life-saving drug at a low price. People were going back into the history of insulin, where the original patent was not protected. It was sold for $1 because there was an understanding about how important this was and how life-saving it is. Bernie Sanders and others have been talking for years and years about how insulin is a tenth of the price in Canada as it is in the United States and in America. You have a such thing in America called insulin debt, because people with diabetes end up going into debt just to afford this life-sustaining medication. And yet we can't get stuff like this in the bill because of this posture where when there's an objection, this time by the parliamentarian, just like it was with the $15 minimum wage last year, even though the parliamentarian can be ignored, and Republicans consistently have ignored the parliamentarian when they tried to do things like stop George Bush from drilling in the Arctic, Democrats love to use the parliamentarian as an excuse not to advance progressive policies that everybody wants. So once the parliamentarian says that something is out of a reconciliation bill, suddenly it takes 60 votes to get it back into the bill. There's of course not 60 votes for anything. That's why we're doing a reconciliation bill, right? Everybody should remember reconciliation.
This one neat trick to actually pass laws.
Exactly. So what Democrats are able to do is to say, oh, we'd really like to have X, Y, and Z, but we're going to take it out, blame the parliamentarian, and then someone like Bernie comes along and says, well, let's try to get it back in. But of course you can't get 60 votes, and Democrats just throw up their hands and say, what can you do? And we get the bare minimum of the bill. Yeah, so that's not the only part that progressives were upset about. The climate side of the bill also has some caveats. Friend of the show, David Sirota, pointed out this clip of Joe Manchin bragging about offshore drilling included in this bill while on Fox News last week.
We are cooking a higher rate of inflation right now ahead of wages. And even if everybody were to go out and get a job or 2 or 3 jobs right now, their wages can't keep up with what the cost of milk, bread, gas, so on and so forth.
Well, don't you think we ought to get those costs down? How you do that? By producing. You've got to produce your way out of this. You can't sit back and wait your way out of it.
So you're going to open pipelines?
Absolutely. We're going to build pipelines. We're going to do more drilling.
How are you going to sell that to the President of the United States, who on day one
it's already been sold
flipped the
and
switch?
bought? It's already been. It's part of the deal. It's part of the bill. All you have to do is read the bill, Harris, and you'll see. You're not going to be able to do any more offshore wind or offshore or onshore solar and wind unless we're absolutely doing more production with drilling and extraction.
So we said in an earlier segment that Republicans understand Democrats more than Democrats understand Republicans. This contravenes that notion. Here, Harris seems to believe that Joe Biden is going to have some issue with opening up drilling and thwarting the interests of climate activists. Absolutely not. This is what leftists have been saying this entire time. He is no friend of the left. He is not your great socialist leader. He is no leftist. He is a corporate Democrat that is much more aligned with Joe Manchin and frankly probably Harris herself than someone like me.
Wow. That's that's strong criticism from you.
I mean, yeah, look, Joe Manchin is completely right. Yeah. You don't have to sell Joe Biden on this kind of thing. The bill is signed, sealed, delivered. He's on board with all of these kind of interventions. It's the completely disempowered left that is leveraging criticisms in this moment, not the Biden administration.
You weren't in yesterday. Bocce was here instead. So I want to get your reaction to we talked about the new tax collectors, with billions of dollars for more IRS agents. What was your view of that?
I think it is a pre-existing issue that the IRS disproportionately audits the poorest people in the United States of America. There has been a map circulating of concentrations of poverty in the country and a map of where audits take place, and it's like the same map in different colors. It's really galling. And I believe that
defund the tax police.
Right. Well, I believe the purpose of this, of adding new people to the new auditors to the IRS is ostensibly to change that dynamic and have more resources to go after more affluent cases. Because one of the arguments is that it's more difficult to prosecute affluent people because they hire accountants, their tax fraud, their ability to get around the system is much more sophisticated. And part of why auditors focus on poor people is they're kind of like it's the path of least resistance, as it were. Whether or not that is actually a problem that will be remedied by hiring more tax auditors, it's a good question.
It seems like an incentives issue, and it's hard to change bad incentives within bureaucracies or large organizations with little accountability.
But I mean, I think there is a problem that needs to be resolved here, regardless of whether or not you hire more auditors. And sitting here and saying, well, I object to more auditors being hired when you never articulated a frustration with the asymmetry of the auditing process before is a big issue. I absolutely think something needs to be done to make sure that affluent people are targeted more for the kinds of audits that should be, I would argue, the sole and principal concentration of an institution like the IRS.
I would have fewer audits across the board, a more simplified tax code, so then there are less people deliberately or inadvertently engaging in fraud or engaging in wrong behavior. If the laws have to be simpler because they're so complicated, everyone could be found. If you have enough people up in your business, enough bureaucrats looking at everything you've done, they'll find something wrong eventually.
Well, part of why the tax codes are so complicated, it's the same thing that happens in the law and a lot of professional spheres. They are intentionally complex because there's a whole industry that's built up around doing your taxes for you, and they lobby
to keep it complicated.
With tons and tons of money every year, exactly, to keep it complicated.
Horrible, horrible. All right, more rising after this.